For more on this fast-moving story, I am joined now by Taqbir Huda, a regional researcher for South Asia at Amnesty International in London, and by DW's Beenish Javed, who's been covering this story from here in Berlin. Taqbir, this is the end of Sheikh Hasinas' government. How would you characterise this day for Bangladeshis?
In a word, it's monumental. We have witnessed nothing comparable in at least recent living memory. It is a restoration of the people's ultimate assertion to their right to be free, to be liberated. In fact, yesterday when I was here, I mentioned that this is a liberation movement. You see, Bangladesh has fought for liberation 4 times now. First from British colonial rule, then Pakistani colonial rule, and then it's now this time as well. So it's it is a liberation movement, and people are ecstatic.
A monumental day. Beenish, can you remind us, because of course these protests began peacefully, didn't they, among students?
Anya, the protests began peacefully, and the protests started because the students were angry at the government of Sheikh Hasina. There was a High Court ruling that reinstated government job quotas. The students were basically angry because they believed that these job quotas prevented them a fair way of applying for these jobs. So these quotas restricted or reserved 56% of the government jobs, and largely the students saw as discriminatory because they believed it was the government of Sheikh Hasina that was taking political advantage of these government job quotas, because 30% of the job quotas were for families and relatives of war veterans that had fought the War of Independence of Bangladesh against Pakistan. And Awami League, the ruling party of Sheikh Hasina, played a critical role, and therefore it was seen largely that this quota basically favors the government of Sheikh Hasina. They started protesting peacefully. Largely the protests were peaceful, and as is the patron of Sheikh Hasina's government, during her 15-year tenure, whenever there have been protests by opposition, by young people, by even environmentalists, there is a pattern that they are quelled and force is used. And this time it was the same strategy, that the protests were quelled through a crackdown, but the students retaliated. They were very angry, and especially because the Prime Minister at that time, Sheikh Hasina, called them collaborators of Pakistan. And this is what they absolutely could not tolerate. And the anger triggered to such an extent where we saw more than 200 people, mostly young people and students, were killed. And even then, the retaliation from the students, despite such a crackdown, didn't stop. And yesterday we saw one of the deadliest days where so many people got killed. And over this, I would say, just a couple of days, rapidly changing situation, I would say, their demands from basically curtailing of the quota system, which actually the Supreme Court did scale back, their demands then changed to resignation of few ministers and some other demands. And then finally, it all consolidated into one single demand, that Sheikh Hasina resign from the government. And this evolved in just a couple of days. And today, there's one of the main demands the students had. We see that their demand, actually, they have pushed for it, and we see these spectacular, I would say, like really unbelievable visuals, what a student protest movement can do in a country.
As we said, an extremely fast-moving story. Taqbir, tell us, what role is the army playing right now in Bangladesh?
So the role of army could noticeably shifted between the two, spates of the protests. And the first one, of course, they were implementing the shoot-on-sight curfew order, it seems, judging by the death toll that we saw. But in the second spate, which started earlier this week, it's reported that they maintained a relatively neutral role, where they weren't the ones using force, but they weren't necessarily intervening in the other security forces who were using force, like the police. So right now, of course, they have they're the only influential group within the state machinery that can restore quote unquote law and order. But protesters have also been very categorical that they didn't oust an autocratic government only to be ruled by a military government. So I think it needs to be very clear that the military's role is highly circumscribed, only to facilitate a transition into an accountable form of governance. And as long as the army realizes that its role is as a mere facilitator and it's a time-bounded exercise, I think that's of crucial importance. And the last time we had military rule in Bangladesh was also at a volatile period, which was back in 2007. So that lasted roughly a year and a few months. So that's the only precedent that we have to go by. And the irony is that the end of that military period is what brought Sheikh Hasina to power, and since then she had remained in power. That's just the immediate precedent that we have as a reference point.
Mm-hmm. Beenish, tell us more about the now toppled government leader, Sheikh Hasina.
Anya, she has a very dramatic and a very tragic history. She was outside, she was not in Bangladesh, and I'm talking about in 1971, Bangladesh was created just a few years after. She was outside of the country, and her entire family, along with her father, was killed. She was outside with her sister. And this basically became, this vengeance, this tragedy and this trauma became a central part of her politics. After a few years, she returned to Bangladesh and then was able to gain massive support from the public. But during her entire political career, we can see that incident really shaped her politics. She was never able to forget what had happened to her family, and therefore we see there was a lot of brutality towards political opposition in Bangladesh, and she used all power when she got into power. And then she used all power from very powerful people around her to maintain her government, and therefore even now we see that reflection, the way she treated these protests. And there is a pattern in her during her entire leadership, that there is always a crackdown on dissent. And this, with the student protest, we can clearly see that there were many chances, and there was room where the government could have negotiated, could have talked with the students, but her rule had become really, really authoritarian, and therefore she was facing a lot of criticism from Bangladeshi people.
Okay. Taqbir, you talked a little bit just now about the transition that we are in the process of witnessing. Is this a dangerous moment for Bangladesh?
I would say it's certainly a volatile moment which has the capacity to be, or potential to be, dangerous if certain risks aren't averted. So as I mentioned, so currently we don't know any of the technicalities of what this interim governance mechanism would look like. But at the same time, you must realize everyone who was brutalized by the very partisan police force, now some of them are in the they have a thirst for vengeance. And there are reports that one particular police station in Jatrabari is surrounded by, individuals who are looking to even the score, if you will, with the police officers there. So, of course, that's why the army chief is encouraging restraint and urging people to go back. So it's incredible. So from a human rights lens, of course, we've seen a range of human rights violations be committed by the security forces in the past few weeks. But now there's a risk that further violations might occur if the thirst for vengeance triumphs over restraint.
Okay. Beenish, tell us where in Bangladesh from whom Sheikh Hasina got her support from, and what position will they be taking now?
This question is really hard to answer, because, of course, there were periods when Sheikh Hasina did have public support, but there are accusations that many times that she won the election, either the opposition boycotted the elections because they didn't trust that the elections would be fair. There are accusations that in some elections she had full support of the country's military who helped rig the election, and through the rigging of the election she won the government. And it's, of course, it's really difficult to understand when you're ruling a country from last 15 years, how do you really assess that do you have public support or not, because the election process has been so weak in the country, where the main opposition have boycotted, where the opposition figures are in jail. I mean, Khaleda Ziad, one of the main opposition figures, she's critically ill, under house arrest. So when the country doesn't have free and fair elections regularly, it is really hard to assess if they enjoy public support or not. So, and the visuals that we see, the number of people that have come on the streets against her speaks largely of the anger and the frustration that many Bangladeshis now have against Sheikh Hasina.
Taqbir, we know that Sheikh Hasina has now landed in India. Did India support her government completely?
I mean, that is what most political analysts will tell you. So that, like, I mean, I think everyone could guess that that would be her natural destination. But what's really important now is that India cooperate with the international community in whatever, hopefully we are, of course, trying to build momentum for an international investigation mechanism. And we're urging the international community to do all it can to build accountability for the severe human rights violations that occurred in the past 3 weeks. So we would encourage UN member states to, which includes India, to be cognizant of their duty to ensure that this does not, impunity does not prevail. Just because her rule has ended or the government has managed to escape should not mean that the deaths that occurred, the hundreds of deaths that have occurred, that the justice still needs to be served for those deaths. And we will only get that if there is an independent investigation into this. And I would just add to that as Beenish was saying, that the weaponization of the trauma that was in 1971 and 1975 is often what led to the brunt of authoritarianism. So I would highly implore that we don't fall into the same trap where we weaponize the trauma from this particular incident to perpetrate further violence, right? We must rise above the violations that led to this moment of liberation to ensure that liberation remains in place.
Beenish, if I could just talk about a moment that in all of the extraordinary images that we've seen in the last hours, not to mention the last days and weeks, a moment that really stands out is the image of the statue of Sheikh Hasina's father. Can you tell us about the significance of what we saw there?
If I say simply, it's basically anger and frustration at Sheikh Hasina. But to me, these visuals are also sad, because Sheikh Mujibur Rahman was the founding father of Bangladesh, and he is hailed as somebody who helped Bangladesh become an independent state. And today, seeing this just shows that the legacy of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman has been damaged, has been severely damaged by Bangladeshis who are angry at his legacy, who are angry at what his daughter has done to the country.
Beenish Javed, DW's Beenish Javed, and Taqbir Huda from Amnesty International. Thank you so much to you both for your analysis, for joining me today.